Okay, hello and good evening, everyone. Today I'm speaking to Professor Robert Pollin. He's at the University of Massachusetts. He's an economist, and he wrote a very interesting book, which he co-authored with Noam Chomsky on the Green New Deal. And we're going to go into basically what they propose, a bit of a brief discussion of that thing. So, Professor Pollin, welcome.
Thanks very much for having me on.
All right. So I want to sort of start with the Green New Deal, and maybe before one starts there, can we get the idea what is the New Deal or what was the New Deal? And take into account, I was only born in 1990, so much longer after, I suppose the mythology has spread.
The original New Deal we're talking about.
Yeah,
So
the
the
original New
original
Deal.
New Deal was the name that was given, and I don't know where the name came from, but it was given to the uh, administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt when he became president. So when Roosevelt became president, inaugurated in 1933, the U.S. and the world were in the depths of the Great Depression. And different places were pursuing different solutions to the Great Depression. So we had the emergence of fascism in much of Europe. Um, in the United States, his predecessor, Roosevelt's predecessor, Herbert Hoover, uh, believed that the solution, or at least the economic policy solution, was to um, balance the fiscal budget and to stabilize the economy that way. So the Roosevelt administration in 1932 or 33 still kind of held on to that economic orthodoxy, but then really pursued what we could call a egalitarian agenda to help people in need, in distress. And that then evolved into an egalitarian agenda that also was seen as a growth agenda. It was a way through which to get the economy out of the Great Depression and do so in a way that was expanding opportunities, creating more stable living conditions, lives, stabilizing capitalism, making capitalism um, more just socially. That's the big idea. Even in the 1930s version of the New Deal under Roosevelt, there was a what we could call a Green New Deal component because one of the main, at least well-known policies, it wasn't that big in size, but one of the big ideas was to create something called a Civilian Conservation Corps that was effectively investments in various kinds of environmental protection and environmental cleanup and support. And so you have the idea there of the convergence between investing in the environment and using that as an engine of job creation. So you have a Green New Deal operating in the 1930s. So jump forward to the present, the idea is to, and I certainly didn't come up with the term, but the idea is broadly to use this imperative of a energy transformation, of a global energy transformation and a global project for emissions reduction, to do so in a way that also um, expands living job opportunities, raises living standards, tackles poverty. So that's really how I think about the Green New Deal.
Okay. So it's got some remnants to the old one, but obviously it takes a new form and life of its own as it's being presented now.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Then sort of is the last question on the old New Deal before we jump into this one. When I read American history and American economists, there seems to be a big debate as to what the legacy of this New Deal is, and a lot of it seems to me to be based on what your politics is. So if I would read anything from Milton Friedman, Chicago School, they tend to be very skeptical against the Green New Deal. But even they, if you read them carefully, would admit that there were some benefits to it. I mean, why is it that the economists seem to be sort of tiptoeing around this story?
Well, it's a massive story to tell, and there's various ways to get at it. And people come in absolutely with preconceptions, myself included, Milton Friedman included. And so you can carve out a story that is consistent with your preconceptions. And that's why it's really important for people to not just communicate with those that they agree with, but really absorb the perspectives of their critics or alternative views and see how well their own views hold up. So, Friedman wrote a very influential analysis of the Great Depression, saying that it was basically the result of incompetence by the central bank, in particular the U.S. central bank. And that otherwise, a free market capitalist economy will operate on its own in support of stability, financial stability, generally rising incomes, and yield basically fair outcomes in terms of what people put into this economy and they get what they deserve. And that is consistent, obviously, with his free market perspective. If you have a free market perspective, you still have to explain the Great Depression, because obviously the global economy collapsed. So if you don't want to blame capitalism, how do you come up with another explanation? And his explanation was that, well, if we had just let capitalism operate on its own, everything would have been fine. The massive failure was on the part of policymakers. The massive failure was on the part of central bankers in mismanagement of the monetary policy, the money supply.
Okay, that's fair enough, and it's just interesting for somebody who's not an economist. Whenever I read on any of these things, as an engineer, put it this way to you, whether energy in particular that I'm more familiar with is managed publicly or privately, tends to be very similar in my view. They all have pathologies. Whether you compare private utilities in France, EDF has got a debt issue at the moment. You can compare it to the failure of private companies sometimes in South Africa to come up with solutions. It depends which conclusions you draw. And just as a basic judgment in my sense is, I think it's more a matter of political will whether these projects often work than it is really about whether it's private or whether it's state-owned.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, let's say some people such as myself that are more on the left will be more comfortable saying that having private businesses undertake these projects is very problematic. Among other things, it creates labor exploitation, inequality, and in any case, businesses are in business to make money. They're not in business to deliver social well-being. And people on the left would say, well, then, we should have more public ownership, more public enterprise. And I'm not totally unsympathetic to that, but we also have to realize that there are massive challenges that will be faced by public enterprise. A lot of them just technical. How do you get from A to B? If we have a fossil fuel-based dominant U.S. or global economy, even with the best of will and the best laid plans, still transitioning a global infrastructure from fossil fuel dominance to renewable zero emission dominance is a gigantic, challenging undertaking. There's no question about it.
Right.
So we have to be respectful, and I would say, humble in understanding the magnitude of the challenge.
Yeah, and that's sort of where I would lead also this conversation into. Now, I'm giving a few numbers here, and I know, as with all these things, you can always pick up the number that you like. But at the end of this century, according to UN projections, 4 out of 10 people in the world will be African, about 4 out of 10 is Asian, and then Latin America, North America, and Europe make out about 2 out of 10 collectively, and Australia is rounding error, So the majority of the population growth will be primarily now in Africa. There's still a lot to do in Asia. Pakistan, for example, hasn't peaked fertility yet, but they're on their way, much better than some people would think. And obviously, when you have such an explosion in population, you need energy. There's no question about it. And the question would be, what would be the best path that Africa would follow? And this is sort of now where I think the big geopolitics come into it, because a lot of African leaders have been making skeptical sounds recently against the green agenda. Some, I think, they're conflicted, to be honest. Some have been more open a little bit, at least in theory. But so this is sort of the energy scene that I want to pick as us, is like, how do we get from no energy in the developing world for many people to more energy, to energy? And you've made the argument that there is a renewable path that can sustain economic growth as well and alleviate the poverty that we see, right?
Yeah, I believe that's true. I mean, I have done work in sub-Saharan Africa, including South Africa. And I presented some lectures on a Green New Deal to the African Development Bank, which included in the group that I spoke to representatives, pretty high level Treasury, central bank officials from different countries. And yeah, I got very mixed reactions. I think over the course of a week when I was giving the lectures, the reactions got more favorable, less hostile. Initially, there was a lot of hostility on the point of saying, well, you're a rich country, you've got a rich country, and it's easy for you to say that we have to transition to another energy source. But what you're trying to do is, leave us in poverty, because for one thing, there are oil and gas resources in Africa that haven't been exploited, and they want to exploit them, of course, meaning people in the different countries. And then secondly, they aren't convinced that renewable energy will provide adequate alternative to enable them to grow. So, and I understand that position, but I also think, number one, that if we take climate science seriously, okay, a lot of people don't, but let's assume that we have to take climate science seriously. We really have no choice but to get onto a zero emission path. And, whether the date is 2045 or 2050, we have to be there. As I read stuff, stuff comes in almost every day. We're already not likely to hit the 1.5 degree emission warming, 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming stabilization target, which means we probably have to also start thinking much more aggressively about adaptation policies, but in the realm of mitigation, of trying to control climate change. Look, every country has to transition, because even today, you could say fairly that US, China, and Europe are the biggest problems, because China is 30% of all emissions, roughly. The US is 15%, and the EU is another 10%. Add those up, that still only gets you to 55%. That's a lot. Right. But that still means 45% is everywhere else in the world. So if you were to shut down emissions to zero in the US, China, and Europe tomorrow, we still are only halfway there. And then on top of that, if we are going to say India is going to grow, Indonesia is going to grow, Latin America is going to grow, sub-Saharan Africa is going to grow, well, then we're back at where we are now. And if we take climate science seriously, the situation is hopeless. If we take it if we say, look, you guys have grown, it's our turn, and we need fossil fuels to grow. If you take that view, then if we also take climate science seriously, then we are basically saying the human species is doomed. that life
Well,
on.
the argument they make is that adaptation is more proportionate, and that African countries can emit, theoretically speaking, as much as they want, as long as they just find ways to adapt to it. And that's sort of everyone is making that argument at the moment. Now, to me, that sounds a bit defeatism. But I do accept the argument that we're going to not even hit 2 degrees. I think we're going to surpass that as well. Based on projections. Maybe I'm wrong. We
Well,
have to
of
be
course,
proven
we
wrong.
would like to think you're wrong. Uh, you know, I mean, these projections bounce around, and as recently as, I don't know, 8 months ago, the International Energy Agency, which is it's not the authority, but it's a
Yeah.
serious mainstream organization. They have a project to get, they have a pathway to get to 1.5 and stabilize at 1.5. Um, their model could be wrong, but we're dealing with science here, and there's a lot of uncertainties.
Right.
Everything has to be understood within a framework of probabilities and not certainty. So I think we have to be as aggressive as possible to try to hit that 1.5 degree target. Maybe we won't get there, but I see a technical path to getting there. I see an economic path to getting there. The technical path really depends on advancing renewables and very high efficiency as the alternative to a fossil fuel dominant infrastructure. Now, as you know, I'm sure because you're working in the field, uh, you know, getting renewables online, let's say getting solar and wind online to generate electricity, you can generate a kilowatt hour of electricity from solar and wind at roughly half the price
Yeah.
of coal, and for that matter, nuclear. So the possibility is there, and investments in energy efficiency. It's hardly high tech stuff. So it's really a matter of raising the investment level to the point at which we really are moving this transition quickly enough.
So the critics to that argument would say, yes, it's cheaper to generate. There's no doubt about it. The prices have crashed through the roof. However, they argue that grid integration is maybe not as simple as one would think. And with wind in particular, we have a NIMBY attitude in Europe. A lot of it's based on bad perception. That's why I'm working for companies building them on a deep sea, for example. And I mean, the engineers would listen to what you're saying. They say, we're right, but practicalities on the ground makes it a little bit difficult. And then there's also just an attitude in many countries. Well, why should we jump first? Well, we just wait for Germany to figure it out, and then the war in Ukraine starts, and we realize maybe there's some issues with Russian gas, and now there's a bit of hesitancy. So what do you sort of make to that skepticism? I don't know if it's legitimate or not.
Well, of course it's legitimate. I mean, again, to say that you can generate a kilowatt of electricity from a solar panel at half the price of natural gas or coal, that's saying something, but it's certainly not telling the whole story. And there's massive challenges to building a renewable dominant system. So, yeah, I mean, the three big ones that are out there that are obvious. One is intermittency that you're referring to, the fact that the sun doesn't shine all day, and the wind doesn't blow all day, and then therefore you have to be able to figure out how to store and transmit from point A to point B. And yes, there are clearly challenges there, and they're big. Uh, Mostly, I don't see them as deep scientific challenges in the sense that we have no idea what to do and we need to figure it out. It's broadly speaking, I think we know what to do, and it's a matter of implementation. But implementation is hard. So you're mentioning one big one. Who wants to look at a wind turbine, in their neighborhood? So, I'm actually doing a study for Greece right now, and that is a big, massive issue, even among the greenest of the green. They hate, because actually there have been lots of turbines erected on mountaintops and in pristine sites. That why? Because they're windy,
Yeah.
and so it's cheaper. You put up the turbine, and you're going to get a higher capacity. So one of the things I'm trying to do with this study is to show, well, look, you can get to a zero emissions economy without destroying the pristine sites and destroying the mountaintops. And so, you know, what's the strategy? Well, you have to put up the solar panels and the turbines, maybe in some places that are somewhat less efficient, but nevertheless, they're still able to generate more than enough energy to run the economy. So that's a big issue. A second big issue is um, with the mineral requirements. They're big. If we're going to have batteries for electric cars, we're going to need lithium, or we're
Yeah.
going to need cobalt, and that means we're going to have to mine it. And what happens there? So that also is a big issue. So I would say these issues around intermittency, around land use, around mineral extraction, they're not trivial. They're huge. It's just that, in my opinion, addressing those problems is a lot more sensible than trying to say, well, climate science isn't real, or it's not that big a deal. The other one may be more controversial for you as a former nuclear engineer. I also would say that renewables is a much superior alternative to nuclear.
Right.
On the question of politics and safety, as we've just been seeing with the Ukraine war, that every nuclear site can be weaponized. And the more you build them out, the more weapons can be used.
Well, the critique against that would say Putin also blew up the wind farms and the solar panels in Ukraine. And so, I suppose it's not radiation, but, it can do that way. I would admit, as somebody in the nuclear industry, that there's a lot of ambition in nuclear that has never lived up to reality. I worked on Hinkley Point. That is a way not to manage a project. So I'd be the first to say that. Although I would say the South Koreans in Dubai have built a plan in a bit of a shorter space of time. Maybe it's a question of competence. France, under the Mesmer plan, did decarbonize fast, but it cost a lot of money. And, there's a lot of arguments. So I'm aware that, I'm not an apostate for nuclear by any means. I'm well aware of the issues involved. I do think, though, this is maybe where I have a slight disagreement, is that countries that have nuclear infrastructure already, like France and Belgium, there is an argument to say, well, let's just upgrade them. Although I would add to that, I think people who think you can upgrade them are overselling as well.
Well, okay, here's my view. So I'm not against, I'm not in favor of totally abolition of nuclear, certainly not in the transition period. But, if you take somebody like James Hansen, who is, in a sense, the father of climate science, or who put the issue of global warming,
Yeah.
he put it on the map. So you've got to give him a lot of respect as a climate scientist. He's not an engineer. He's not a nuclear. He's not any kind of energy engineer, but he is a very, very strong proponent of nuclear. And he says there's no way we can solve the climate crisis without massive build out of nuclear. And he's saying tenfold. So there's, correct me if I'm wrong, there's something in the range of 400 nuclear power plants operating in the world now. So according to Hansen, we'll go from 400 to 4,000. That means they're going to be scattered pretty much all over the world. And just on the question of safety, are we completely convinced that each and every one of them is going to be completely safe, carefully regulated, protected, immune from invasion, like what Putin has been threatening? My answer is no. And even if my answer was yes, and I thought there was absolutely no alternative in terms of climate science, I would say, okay, if there's no alternative, then yes, let's go with nuclear and do our best and gamble. But we do have an alternative, and I think the alternative is high efficiency and renewables. And that one has its own problems. There's no question about it,
Right.
but they are less severe problems. They're more readily soluble than what I see with either, burying our head in the sand, or depending on either nuclear, or we haven't talked about carbon capture, but my view on
No,
carbon.
that's a scam.
Yeah.
I'm working on a project on that now. It's a scam. Like I'm not convinced carbon capture can do what any, not even people in the oil industry is convinced on that. I'll be totally honest with you.
Yeah.
How do you trap a gas that disperses like this? I've got no idea.
Yeah.
So I'm not convinced carbon capture is going to be an answer to it. I would say though, natural gas to me sounds more sensible as the transition fuel. I still add that to the argument, just for the fact that methane concentrations is less than CO2 in the atmosphere. But if you keep on doing that, it's not a solution either.
Right. I
So
mean, burning natural gas generates about half the emissions of coal, and about 30% or 25% less than oil. So relative to coal, certainly it's cleaner, but it's still, if we're talking about getting to zero, it doesn't get you there. And the if we're going to build out nuclear power plant, natural gas plants, now damn well that their owners aren't going to say, "Oh, sure, we'll shut down in 10 years." Not happening. So,
right.
and the other issue, of course, especially with fracking, is the methane leakages in production. And my understanding of the literature is, if you experience leakages at the level of more than 5% in production, effectively natural gas becomes as lethal as coal in terms of overall greenhouse gas effects.
Okay, well, that one is due to me, but I'll take your word for that. I want to get sort of on the solutions that you proposed in the book a little bit, and the first one is the cost involved. I was actually surprised that it's not as much money as people think it is, right? Can you maybe give us a sense of like how many dollars? There was a trillion per year type of dollar that floated around. And when I compare that to the Afghanistan war and the Iraq war, I thought that, there's not really an
Or
argument.
bailing out of the COVID. I mean, no, and I've tested this multiple times, and I know about other studies, and the other studies that I think are pretty good are more or less in line with mine, even though, my model, I came up independently. So, my model is actually very, very simple. And I say, let's assume economic growth. We can talk about degrowth if you want to, but let's assume economic growth continues, and especially, low income countries. But it's going to be growth with a foundation of a clean energy system, and a less uh, uh, a less toxic agricultural system as well. So let's assume that's the character of growth. And then how much do we have to spend to transition to this clean energy system? And, I just looked at the data on how much it costs to put up wind farms or solar panels, and projected those figures out
Right.
relative to what I saw as demand. And the demand would be based on how fast economies are growing, and including, as you mentioned, population, how fast economies are growing, and then how much we can gain in terms of efficiency. So that's the model. And in doing that, I came up with a global figure, that it would cost about $4.5 trillion per year on average between now and 2050.
Right.
And at today's level of economic activity, it would be about 2.5 trillion. So that's, sounds like a gigantic number, and it is. On the other hand, scale it relative to the size of the global economy, it's about 2.5%, 2.5% of global GDP,
And
which
obviously that number is not, it's not just money that we throw away like in a war, because you have an economic benefit to that.
you have a lot of economic benefits. So it's 2.5%. You are generating jobs. You are creating, in the end, you have energy that is cheaper forget about green for a second. You have cheaper energy through two channels. Number one, we're raising efficiency levels. And number two, we have solar and wind, and they're cheaper now. So you have cheaper energy, you have smaller scale, so that sub-Saharan Africa, rural regions that have no electricity right now, that depend on diesel fuel and kerosene, will have access to clean, inexpensive energy. So those are the additional benefits once we move in this direction towards a clean energy transition. I've also looked at, comparing in sub-Saharan Africa, countries that are oil exporters now versus those that aren't.
Right.
And look at their economic performance over time. Effectively, there's no difference. You might say, well, how can you, if you don't let us dig up this oil, you're relegating us to poverty. Well, I don't see any evidence that the countries on average that are exporters are doing better. Largely, that's due to, what we call the resource curse, that you end up building your whole economy around, your revenue from oil extraction, which then invites all kinds of corruption and so forth, and as opposed to trying to build a more general, resilient infrastructure. And so I think overall, it's an entirely feasible project. And then when I came up with my model, and then I see these other models like International Renewable Energy Agency came up with their own model of getting to zero by 2050. And lo and behold, they came out with the same number as me, like exactly the same number. I don't know how
they copied your results.
They did their model, but yeah, okay. Mine was 4.5 trillion per year to 2050. There was 4.4 trillion per year till 2050.
Okay, well, it's an interesting number. I mean, because by the way, if you do the same exercise only for fossil fuels, I don't think the numbers will be much different, to be honest.
No.
Because you have to develop economies that aren't developed yet. That's the argument that I think is missing. So it's a more of a choice, in my view, than a technology issue. I would argue the technology is there. I think it's maybe a bit too much ambition how fast it can go and stuff. But I'm all for throwing money at it and saying let's achieve it. The other point I thought what I found was very interesting is that you addressed one elephant in the room, which was the Gilets jaunes riots in France. That these policies would provoke riots on the streets, and when fuel prices go up, people get angry and topple the governments. So how do you speak to those people who say, look, but fine, I hear the climate scientists, but I'm also scared that I don't want a coup d'etat in my country when the fuel price goes up?
Right. Well, I mean, the simple solution, which we should be doing right now, the simple immediate solution is, if the fossil fuel prices go up, then the fossil fuel prices are high, but that we subsidize people. We don't subsidize the fossil fuel industry. We subsidize people. So we compensate people for the additional costs of energy, and thereby, by letting the oil price go up and subsidizing energy, that also encourages renewable energy. And at the same time, if you're subsidizing energy, renewables, and efficiency, we can get efficiency gains tomorrow. In fact, I'm reading you're in Europe, I'm not, but I know that at least what I've read is that there already have been gains in energy efficiency to some significant degree in the face of the high prices. So that's I think, we have to be really aggressive in terms of these transitional issues, including the transition for people that are working in the fossil fuel industry and the communities that are dependent on the fossil fuel industry. So we have to be able to design policies to move people out of their fossil fuel jobs into other kind of jobs, to invest in the communities that are currently dependent on fossil fuels. And Germany, I think, is probably the best example now in terms of what they did in the Ruhr Valley, which was the heavy coal region, and creating new renewable energy projects.
Okay. But why is there so much skepticism against Germany at the moment, though? I mean, they're saying, is that propaganda purely, or is it some of it founded as well?
Well, Germany has been kind of the leader in thinking through energy transition, but they're in the face of what's going on with Russia and their dependence on Russian gas. They're reverting back to coal, and they are relaxing, their commitments.
Yeah.
So, what do you do with that? I think that the number one thing in terms of energy transition is to exactly what I just said, keep a focus on allowing the fossil fuel prices to be high, but designing policies to protect people so that either they are compensated in terms of income, or compensated, or in addition compensated in terms of access to renewable energy and access to high efficiency, including things like just better access to public transportation, so that people who are reliant on cars don't have to be as reliant on cars, and so forth.
Mm. I want to ask you a bit about the efficiency. Again, the critiques against that argument. I don't think people critique insulation. It's actually the one thing that everyone agrees on, that we need more insulation and we need more efficiency. But one argument that always comes up is Jetson's paradox, that the more you gain efficiency, the more you will spend. Is that true to us even in post-industrial economies?
I've looked at the literature, of course, and for the most part, I don't think the so-called rebound effect or the Jevons paradox is really that strong, and it's certainly not in advanced countries. Why? Well, because not totally, but we're already at a point of near saturation, I think, in terms of some of the ways that we consume energy. Are we going to light our houses 40% more if it's cheaper? Are we going to drive? Maybe drive 10% more. We're not going to use appliances that much more. So I think, in the case of the high income advanced economies, the Jevons effect is pretty weak. It's not zero,
Right.
but it's pretty weak. And I think, this so-called rebound effect, when Jevons first, William Stanley Jevons, this economist around 1860, first developed it, you have to remember, he was seeing it as a positive. The fact that you could utilize coal more cheaply was good, because they wanted to utilize coal more cheaply. In our current situation, we want to introduce efficiency, not to utilize coal more cheaply, but to not utilize coal at all.
Right.
So you can also design policies around that. Also, if you look at, you can compare different high-income countries, for example, in terms of their level of energy intensity, their rate of energy consumption now. And, there's massive differentials. So Germany, for example, is twice as efficient right now as the United States in its level of energy consumption.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, and we do not see Germany just saying, oh, great, now we can just consume more. They have an infrastructure that is supportive of a more highly efficient economy. South Africa is highly inefficient. If you can compare South Africa, for example, to Brazil, that are roughly equal per capita income levels, but Brazil is far more efficient. So, and again, we don't see Brazil saying, oh, let's consume energy at the level of South Africa. So it really depends on the overall economic infrastructure under which the economy operates. And so I don't think that the overall, that we're going to see a lot of rebounds, and rebound meaning people are going to consume way more. Now that could be, a different story in the developing world, because For example, I mean, if we're thinking about sub-Saharan Africa and rural regions that have no access to electricity, so they're using kerosene. And so now let's say we're going to introduce solar into communities. Yeah, they're going to want to use it. They're going to want to use it for the basic things that we use it for. But that's okay as long as it's solar. So if we're building out a new energy infrastructure in low-income economies, as long as it's a clean energy infrastructure, we don't have to worry so much about the Jevons effect.
Right, we're just building out infrastructure as we would have built anyone else. It's interesting, thought, because it's often used to discredit energy efficiency, and I just don't understand the argument against going for more energy efficiency. It doesn't make sense. There's people arguing against that.
The argument is the rebound effect that people are just gonna consume more. But
so what?
Yeah, so dig into that. Number one, we don't see a lot of evidence. And number two, if we are transitioning to a renewable dominant energy infrastructure, then right, that's good. We want people to have more. We want the schools. And I mean, I myself am actually involved in a project in Burundi, in sub-Saharan Africa. And yeah, we want the kids to be able to run computers. They can't now. Right. We want the hospitals to be able to use their equipment 24 hours a day. They can't now. So yes, the energy consumption will go up, but we want it to be clean energy.
Okay, it's a very valid point. How would you think that we fund this now? This whole transition and things. That's always the question: who pays, and who do you pay money for, and how do you make sure the money isn't stolen, and how's it managed, things of that sort.
Yeah. Well, if we begin with this point that we're looking at 2.5% of GDP. Of course, it's tons of money, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not that big. What happened during COVID, when the global economy went into lockdown, economies, OECD, the high income economies, somehow found 30% of GDP like that within weeks or months. So I'm talking about 2.5% of GDP. Just in the US. I mean, the United States, forget about even the US Treasury borrowing money. The Federal Reserve injected about 10% of GDP into Wall Street, like that. So is the money there? Of course it's there.
Right.
It's a question of mobilizing it, and therefore it becomes a political question. And that's the political question that is, predominant right now at the COP27 meetings, that, the poor countries are saying the rich countries have to pay, the rich countries saying, oh, sure, but then they don't do anything. And so, I think, yes, the rich countries have to pay. But as you were saying yourself a bit ago, we shouldn't just think of it as a cost. We shouldn't just think of it as them having to pay. There are big benefits here. Number one, you sell electricity. You're going to get your money back. Number two, you're going to stimulate your economies through job creation. You're going to expand opportunities for small scale businesses. You're going to expand opportunities for farmers, because if you do dual use agriculture, in other words, you have the farmland, but then you can put up some turbines, or you put up some solar panels without any significant loss of agricultural productivity. The farmers are richer. The money is going back to the farmer as opposed to going to some oil company.
Right.
So there's a lot of benefits, and I would like to see the discussion around financing recognizing the benefits as well as the costs. That said, I mean, we already, like right now, global economies operating with fossil fuel subsidies, averaging about 2% of GDP. So all you have to do is, just think in simple terms, you could shift the existing fossil fuel subsidies into green subsidies, you're almost there. You've almost, I mean, this is broad
How is
generalization.
that subsidies calculated though? Because there's been some people arguing that they are counting emissions as subsidies, and it's not really subsidies. I mean, is this direct money, or is it just the emissions times the social cost of carbon?
No. When I say that, yeah, there are different ways to calculate.
Right.
It's true, but when I say it's about 2% of GDP, I'm talking about government money to lower the price of fossil fuels to help people to get through.
Right. Have you thought of the geopolitical implications of what you're saying here? Because I'm assuming you have. I mean, I was thinking Saudi Arabia, although they are investing in renewables now, but all those oil states, Angola, even Brazil to an extent, even the US Exxon. I mean, they aren't going to be very happy if somebody comes up with a proposal to say let's move away, and it might be a geopolitical pivot as well.
Well, that is the big challenge, right? I mean, let's say I'm approximately right in saying that the technical challenges, the economic challenges exist, but they're easy to resolve on paper. They're not insurmountable. But the big problem is, what do we do with the people that are benefiting off of our existing fossil fuel energy system that like benefiting and don't want to stop benefiting? It's simply a matter of politics and organizing. And, I think one of the ways that we can strengthen the position of people committed around saving the planet, the mere saving the planet, is to, first of all, recognize the imperative of a transition for the workers and communities. Without that, you're going to face, implacable opposition, like you talked about in France with the yellow vests. That would be repeated over and over again, unless, for example, unless you say, well, yes, we will subsidize your income, not fossil fuel purchases per se, but income to get out of this. And we will be committed around creating jobs in other areas for people who are currently dependent on fossil fuels. So that certainly doesn't get us all the way, but at least it relaxes some of the opposition. In terms of these petro states, it's just a matter of, you're not going to convince them of anything. But if you convince people who are consuming what they have to sell, what choice do they have? Take my university as just one tiny example, which is now committed to being zero emissions by 2032. If we don't buy any oil and gas, what can they do about it?
Well, I mean, they're already responding to it. I mean, Total and BP and even them are relabeling themselves as energy companies. They're no longer just oil and gas. Another one, which I'm not sure if you've touched on the book, I can't remember, is geothermal. There's some renewed interest in that as well. And that's actually thanks to the technology of fracking. It might work, it might not work. France is piloting a few places now where they're trying to run the heat pumps on geothermal energy. It might be more efficient.
Right. Okay. So as a one tiny example, my building that I work in, I'm not there now, but where my office is, it's 100. It's zero emissions. It's in a cold climate, Western Massachusetts. We have solar panels on the roof. We have very high efficiency, and we have geothermal wells. And that's the way we get there. And if you can do it in a cold climate, not particularly sunny climate, not particularly windy climate, like Western Massachusetts, pretty much you can do it anywhere. And, of course, there was upfront capital expenditures, but over time, the energy consumption costs are lower. So you make up for your capital expenditures. And those are the kinds of things that, when we talk about financing, those are the things that need to be factored in and taken seriously.
That's the one that took me a while to understand, is the gain in efficiency. It's not very intuitive in the beginning how that pays back. I mean, it sounds easy. Okay, efficiency should pay back, but it's sort of like a negative interest rate in a certain sense, over a long
Fair
period of
enough.
time. Yeah,
If that helps you to think about it.
yeah,
I mean, if you're spending $1,000 a year on energy, you invest in energy efficiency, and now we're going to spend $800 instead of 1,000. The 200 that you just spent can pay back your capital expenditures, and after that, you're free and clear.
Okay, and would you argue, in a sort of final point that we get into, that every country has an opportunity, and it's possible to achieve this in every country in the world?
Absolutely. So, I just did a study for South Korea, about 8 months ago. Most countries are on, at least on paper, in terms of rhetoric, they say they're for this green, transition, South Korea being one of them. Greece, and I've done a lot in the US. I've done stuff in South Africa, Indonesia, Germany. Every country, obviously, there are specific features that are just for any given country, but the overall framework, I think, is quite robust to alternative country situations. And take South Korea, which is basically a high income country now. And the South Korea landmass is tiny. But I mean, their own, whatever Energy Research Institute, this government funded, is saying that South Korea can get to zero. And they basically are through developing solar and wind. So you talk about landmass, they have half the landmass of Greece, but they're understanding the ways in which they can utilize their available land resources.
Okay, and would you bet that in 2030 or 2050, maybe 2030 is too far away, that most of the world would have listened to somebody like you and gone that direction already? Or do you think fossil fuels are going to win out? Because there's some people, I myself am personally betting on natural gas still to be playing a role. I know that's controversial, but I'm not. I won't. I would love to be proven wrong.
Of course, I'm not going to bet against myself. That wouldn't be.
Right.
That'd be inside trading. I like to invoke this famous quote from Gramsci: "Pessimism of the mind, optimism of the will." So I don't really know. Who knows? There's a lot of reasons to be discouraged. But I don't really see there's any choice. One of my former students, PhD student from Bangladesh. So she said she's the only green economist in the whole country. But and Bangladesh probably is one of the countries that is most exposed to the impacts of sea level rise. So there better be some more green economists coming up in Bangladesh in a few years. And it's in what she's telling me in Bangladesh, they are doing pilot projects on this thing I was talking about before, dual use agriculture, as an alternative to start digging up coal. So, there's signs going both ways.
Okay. Oh, I mean, as an engineer, I'm kind of neutral because you need me to build whatever you want. If I'm really just self-interested in the whole story, obviously, I'd like to see things going in a more positive direction. But I'm glad to see that even the big energy companies are really, at least in rhetoric, thinking of this. But the argument they would put up is this: is like, the energy sector is a multi-trillion-dollar industry. A lot of the money they manage is based in pension funds, things of this sort. And that is kind of where the inertia comes from. I don't think it's just callousness on their behalf. I mean, there is some of that, but some of it is really the inertia against risk taking is very huge that I've seen from at least the bigger companies. Smaller guys, they run with innovation, and usually if there's a good idea that works there, they buy them out. So that's sort of how I see this thing will evolve.
Well, the pension funds are not part of the companies. They own some the assets. That's true, but there's other ways to, to generate returns. And if, as should be understood over time, the investing in fossil fuels is high risk, and we have these alternative transitions that are going to be increasingly subsidized. Then it's a good bet
Right.
to move your money out of fossil fuels. Not all in one day, of course, but we have to do. If we're going to do things incrementally, we have to start doing them more aggressively, because every year we wait, then we're still faced with the same level of transition, except less time in order to accomplish the transition.
Okay, that's very interesting. For the audience who would like to read more of your work and things of that sort, where do they follow you? I'm assuming you're not on Twitter, are you?
No, I'm not. I'm not even on Facebook. I'm not on Instagram. I'm an old fuddy-duddy. I don't do social media. But we do have our institute. I'm a co-director of the Political Economy Research Institute, and we do have a website. And yes, the person that manages the website she does our outreach on social media. So all the work is there. So the book with Gnome is out. It's been out for a couple of years. So we tried to compress a lot of the research and so forth into that small book. So most all the research can be found at the website of our institute, Political Economy Research Institute.
Okay. Well, I mean, as somebody who was employed in the fossil fuel industry, still is partially, I'd like to thank you at least for making me rethink some of these things. And I think people should read it. People need to challenge themselves with the different ideas. And I'm not opposed to most of what is being said in the book. I think it's a good idea. I'm skeptical of practicalities, but it might work it
It's
out.
totally fair. It's fair to be completely skeptical.
Yeah.
And, it's only through being skeptical that we can really fight through. Like I said, I never would say that, a transition to a global renewable energy system is obvious and easy.
Yeah.
The fact that it is, to me, at least obvious on paper, at least makes it feasible. But to go from something on paper that's straightforward to something that's actually happening in the world, it's a massive, massive challenge. And the only reason to undertake the challenge is I don't really see any alternative.
Yes,
As Margaret Thatcher once said, there is no alternative.
Yeah.
He meant no alternative to neoliberalism.
So you're quoting okay, so you're turning their logic against them.
Yeah.
Okay, I like that one. Anyways, Professor Pollin, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thanks very much. Really nice talking to you.